Hello, this is Mr. Williams here in the AJK kitchen. Today we're going to be cooking a butternut squash mac and cheese. The ingredients which I've got in front of me are butternut squash, olive oil, whole milk, although you can use semi-skimmed if you need to, flour, Dijon mustard, but you can swap out for other kinds of mustard, macaroni, again whatever pasta works best for you. I've gone for pre-grated cheddar and pre-grated parmesan just to save myself some time. And I've also got some sage and rosemary there. The next thing we need to do is chop up the butternut squash. Butternut squash can be a little bit tricky to chop up. It's got quite a thick skin, so you need to make sure you're really careful. First of all, make sure that you've got the butternut squash on a nice, stable surface like this. Then take your knife and working hard, slicing through the bottom. Turn it the other way around. And then take off the top. We've done that because that gives us a bit more of a stable surface for us to be able to remove the skin. You can do this with a vegetable peeler if you want to, but that'll take quite a bit of time. So I'm going to use my knife to peel off this tough outer skin from the butternut squash. To save myself a bit of time, I'm going to chop it in half again. I then take my knife, making sure my fingers are well out of the way, and using a sawing motion, cut down the side of the butternut squash. I'm looking to expose that inner orange flesh and get rid of that tough outer skin. I'm now going to dice up my butternut squash. Making sure the butternut squash is on a flat surface, I'm going to make 3 cuts all the way through from the top to the bottom of the butternut squash, like so, before sticking it back together, rotating it 90 degrees, and doing the same thing again with 3 cuts. Finally, I'm going to take the individual bits and chop them into chunks like so. One thing that I've done in advance is I've made sure that I've preheated my oven to about 180 degrees Celsius if you've got a fan oven, or if you haven't got a fan oven, about 200 degrees Celsius. I'm now going to continue preparing my butternut squash. This is the half that's a little bit trickier because it's got some seeds in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my butternut squash is flat, chop it in half, which exposes the inner seeds. What I'm then going to do is take a spoon, as I find this works best, and scoop out those seeds from the inside. I use a metal spoon because I feel it digs in, but also means that I'm not chopping out too much of the butternut squash itself. And now I'm going to dice up the rest of my butternut squash. This is the bit that I've de-seeded. So I'm going to make sure, again, I've got a nice flat surface on the butternut squash for me to chop with. I'm making sure I'm being careful with my fingers. And I chop down, and again, I'm looking for 3 quite chunky, almost chip-like bits. Now these have come out a little bit thicker than the others. And I've got to be careful because I've got some thick bits of butternut squash there and some thinner bits there. What I don't want when they're roasting is for them to get overcooked. I don't want for bits to burn and for some bits to be undercooked. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to chop off these thicker bits here. I'm now going to get my veg ready for roasting. I'm just going to keep it super simple with my seasonings, with a bit of olive oil to help it roast, to give it a little bit of colour and extra flavour, some salt to bring out the flavour, and pepper just to give it a real depth of base. The first thing that I am going to do then is just drizzle in a little bit of olive oil. You could, if you wanted to, measure it using a spoon, but I find it's easier if I just use my eye and give it a drizzle over the top. You can always add more oil in if you need to. The next thing I'm going to do is just sprinkle in a bit of salt. I could, if I wanted to, pour it into the palm of my hand just so I've got a bit more control, but I'm going to use one that has a kind of strainer there. That way I've got a bit more control. Start slowly and begin to angle over the butternut squash so you've got control over your salt. And you want to make sure that each piece of butternut squash has got a bit of salt on it. Again, that'll draw out some of the moisture, making the flavour richer. Finally, you're going to take your black pepper and do the same thing. Some people might have it pre-ground, in which case use the same idea as the salt, just being very careful to start with. Some of you may have a pepper grinder, in which case grind away. And again, you want to give it a nice even covering. It's best to do it from a bit of a height because you'll see there's a lot of fine pepper dust which spreads out kind of more evenly over the butternut squash. Now, you can either use your hands or a spoon just to mix things through. I prefer to use my hands because that way I've got more control and making sure that everything is evenly coated. I'm now going to move my butternut squash here that's prepped into the oven. I'm going to use oven gloves. Even though the roasting tin isn't hot, the oven, which remember we preheated to 180 degrees Celsius if we've got a fan oven, or 200 if we're using a normal oven, that's insides of that are still going to be incredibly hot, and I don't want to burn my wrists or the inside of my arms. So I'm going to use oven gloves just to make sure that I'm being extra safe. I open up the oven and often there's a bit of a waft of hot air, so I just give that a second so I don't burn my eyebrows off. I then take the butternut squash and pop it in the oven. So my water for the pasta has just finished boiling. I've added in lots of salt water because this speeds up the cooking process and it also seasons my pasta. I'm going to use oven gloves to take the lid off because the lid is going to be very hot. I'm going to be using the macaroni that I was able to buy on the Hertford Road. The cooking instructions are here on the front saying it will take anywhere between 8 to 10 minutes. I'm going to cook it for 8 minutes because I don't want it to be too overdone because it's going to go back in the oven just to crisp up at the end of the cooking process. I've chopped off the very corner of the bag to make it easier to pour, so I'm now going to add it into my water. I'm trying to pour away from me so it doesn't splash. And I've now got my pasta in the pot. I give that one quick stir through, quickly with a spoon, holding the handle just to make sure it doesn't move too much, before returning my lid to my pasta. The lid's cooled down so I don't need to use an oven glove for that. I'm then going to wait for my pasta to return to the boil before turning it down a little bit, as what I don't want is for the pasta water to boil over and that starchy water to get onto my work surfaces. It's just an absolute pain to clear up and no one wants that to happen. My pasta's now finished cooking as per the instructions, so I'm going to take the lid off again, making sure I don't get any water on myself, and just place it on a heat resistant surface. I'm then going to take the saucepan using my oven gloves and put it across to the sink where I have got a colander ready to strain my pasta. I put the colander flat in the sink. I don't want my hands anywhere near this boiling hot water. And I pour the water and the pasta in. I just put my saucepan to one side. The plastic is fine, nice and cool. I move the pasta around a little bit just to drain off any excess water because that's something that I don't want. And then I'm going to put it into a larger bowl because I know I'm going to be mixing this up with a sauce later. I'm now going to take my butternut squash out of the oven. It's been there for about 25 minutes. Use my oven gloves again, making sure that I'm not going to catch myself on any of the hot metal parts of the oven. I'm going to open the oven again and just wait a few seconds because I know there's going to be that big gust of warm air that I talked about earlier. And I'm just going to turn my oven off for the time being because I don't need it on. I'm going to use the grill later though. I'm now going to take 2/3 of my butternut squash out and place it into a bowl, which I'm going to use to mash it up. You could, if you've got one at home, use a blender, but be careful because they can be a bit difficult when you're using something hot. To mash it up, I'm going to be using a rolling pin and a fork. Normally, I would use a potato masher, but as you can see, I'm in the AJK kitchen and I'm being super adaptable with the resources that I have. And I transfer that across. Making sure again, if I need to, I put my oven glove on. I'm not looking to burn my hand doing this. The rest of it I'm going to reserve later, and I'm just going to stir through with the pasta at the very end. I'm now going to start mashing my butternut squash. Again, usually I'd use a potato masher, but I'm going to use my rolling pin. Whatever you're using here, just make sure you're mashing this up into a really smooth and fine paste, or as smooth as you can get it. It'll be really smooth if you do it in a blender. Take care because some of the butternut squash could still be a bit hot. Next thing I'm going to do is add in my milk. The recipe calls for 560 millilitres of milk, which is about the size of a 1 pint carton. Add half of the milk to start with and then begin mixing with a wooden spoon. It will come out really liquidy at the start, but keep going and remember that we'll be adding a roux to this later, which is really going to thicken up that sauce and make it absolutely wonderful. Now add in the rest of your milk and continue to mix it through with a wooden spoon. Again, this is still going to be quite liquidy, but we will be adding that roux in a moment, so that will thicken the sauce up really nicely. Make sure the sauce is nice and combined. I'm now going to turn my pan back on because I'm about to make a roux. Usually you make a roux with butter and flour, but I'm going to use olive oil instead. Turn your pan onto this on a medium heat. Remember, it needs to be on the back of the hob, just in case you spill anything. That way it's got a bit more space before it gets to you. I'm now going to add in the olive oil, and I'm going to do it tablespoon at a time. And for this recipe, I use 4 tablespoons of olive oil. I'm now going to add in my 1.5 tablespoons of flour into the oil mixture. And as soon as it hits the pan and I've finished putting it in, I begin to mix it, and we can see the flour mixing with the oil. At this point, we've got what is called a blonde roux because it's really pale, and our aim here is to cook out that flour flavour. I had my pan on too high a heat, so I've taken it off the heat and turned it down just because my roux was beginning to catch and I didn't want that to happen. I continue to mix to make sure again that it's being continually exposed to the heat. Now that my roux is ready, I then add in half of my butternut squash mixture and gently begin to mix, and the sauce will go from being really liquidy to starting to thicken up. Again, you want to do this over a medium heat. I now add in the second half of my butternut squash mixture, making sure that I scrape everything out of the bowl that I've been using and into my sauce. I then make sure that I give the sauce a good mix, and again, I keep it going for a minute or two just until I've made sure that it's lovely and thick. Add in 2 teaspoons of mustard. If you don't have a teaspoon, use a tablespoon, and that would amount to about 1 tablespoon of mustard. I'm just going to stir that through because I do not want one bit that's super mustardy. I want a gentle mustard flavour the whole way through. I'm now going to add some additional seasoning to my sauce. So first of all, I'm going to take some sage and I'm going to add that in. I'm now going to add in some rosemary. Again, you'd want to use maybe a chopped teaspoon of rosemary if you were using fresh, or try it. If I bought cheese that needed grating, I'd make sure that once I got my sauce sorted, I would grate my cheese quickly. You'll need 300 grams of cheddar grated and about 200 grams of parmesan also grated. I'm now going to mix my sauce into my pasta. Try and use the biggest bowl that you can find. This was obviously the biggest one that I had in the AJK kitchen. Initially, the pasta will be a little bit stuck together because we cooked it earlier, so you just need to be really careful with breaking it up. Before that though, I'm going to make sure that I'm adding in some cheese, saving some for later, and the parmesan. Make sure that your parmesan is grated finely. We're now going to mix through the cheese into our sauce. Make sure again that you're doing this carefully because that pasta will be a little bit stuck together, but the more you mix, the more the mixture will start to loosen up. Keep mixing, making sure there's no clumps of pasta and that the sauce is evenly distributed around the food. I now check my pasta for seasoning, adjusting with salt and pepper and anything else that I feel is necessary, adding and tasting at a time and mixing things through. Quick final check for seasoning, just make any last adjustments with the salt and the pepper, and I'm really happy with that, so I don't add anything more. Add in any remaining butternut squash, gently folding through to avoid breaking up the pieces. And here is the finished product. Don't be afraid to get the cheese all the way over to the edges and to leave it under the grill just to make sure it gets extra crispy. I'm now getting ready to serve. I hold the tray in one hand using an oven glove, and I use a fish slice or a spatula to get out the pasta. Unfortunately, I did not do a very good job of plating up. All of the crispy topping ended up at the bottom, and I even managed to get some on my work surface, which was not what I was going for. So there it is, your completed butternut squash mac and cheese. I hope you and your families have enjoyed cooking together and enjoy eating it as well.